Before the highlighting of the work, The System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age by Charles Upton, I'd like to expand upon the definition of where this school of thought has arisen from. The Traditionalist school of thought, also known as Perennial philosophy, this particular work by Charles Upton is probably one of the most detailed and exhaustive dissertations on the subject of Antichrist, far more in-depth than any fundamentalist type of eschatological perspective. For instance, left behind theology is an example, which I think to be utterly false, based on a fiction, not necessarily scripture. Based in premillennial dispensationalism. So now we're going to offer an alternative perspective on the subject, and this book does so quite adequately, in my opinion, which is why I'm revisiting the perennial wisdom in respect to the Christ/Antichrist dichotomy. I've briefly covered some of the material in past posts. All you'll have to do is to review them, perhaps. So, to begin, I'd like to hit on what Gemini AI overview says concerning perennial philosophy and its school of thought in comparative theology, theology of religions, and world religions in general. So the AI overview, perennial philosophy, is a philosophical and spiritual school of thought that suggests that all religions share a core of wisdom. The term comes from the Latin philosophia perennis, which means perennial wisdom. What does perennial philosophy say? Perennial philosophy suggests that the common themes in religions reveal universal truths about reality, ethics, consciousness, and humanity. It suggests that all religions share a single metaphysical truth or origin. It suggests that the individual can realize this divine reality through a path of mystical ascent. It suggests that this divine reality is immanent and transcendent. This fits well with inclusivism and pluralism, as well as panentheism, which I've discussed thoroughly, which has both transcendent and immanence. All in God. So it by no means contradicts such ideas. Who first used the term? The Renaissance humanist Agostino Stoico first used the term in 1540. That's quite a ways back. So the school of thought is by no means new. Who has contributed to perennial philosophy? Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Aldous Huxley, who authored A Brave New World and wrote quite an extensive text on the perennial philosophy, are some of the thinkers who have contributed. So there are indeed criticisms, and I would say mostly these come from the exclusivist religion, exoteric schools of thought. Some say that perennial philosophy does violence to the traditions it tries to cohere. Of course, this is all via perceptual intelligence, I would say. Some say that perennialists tend to rank religions hierarchically. So Wikipedia on the term perennial philosophy. Also referred to as perennialism and perennial wisdom, is a school of thought and philosophy and spirituality, not just theology or a separate category of religions or world religions, that posits that the resource of common themes, and there are indeed common themes of which many exclusivists tend to overlook in their zeal to uphold one religious traditions as superior. Recurrence of common themes across world religions illuminates universal truths, not just the particularities about the nature of reality. And this is where metaphysics enters into the picture. Humanity, ethics, and consciousness itself. Some perennialists emphasize common themes in religious experiences and mystical traditions across time and cultures. Others argue that religious traditions share a single metaphysical truth or origin from which all esoteric or inner mystical teachings and exoteric or outer public tradition, knowledge, and doctrine have developed. Perennialism has its roots in the Renaissance era interest in Neoplatonism and its idea of the one from which all existence emerges. So there we have the idea of that emerged in the making of the Matrix films, Neo being the one. Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 1499, sought to integrate Hermeticism with Greek and Christian thought, discerning a Prisca found in all ages. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, 1463 to 1494, suggested that truth could be found in many rather than just two traditions, or three for that matter. He proposed a harmony between the thought of Plato and Aristotle and saw aspects of the Prisca in the Quran, the Kabbalah, and other sources. And so Agostino Stoico coined the term Philosophia Perennis, 1497 to 1548. Developments in the 19th and 20th centuries integrated Eastern religions and universalism, the idea that all religions, on some level, underneath apparent differences, point to the same truth. And of course, that one truth being the one true God of all creation. The idea that all religions underneath apparent differences point to the same truth. In the early 19th century, the Transcendentalists propagated the idea of a metaphysical truth and universalism. This inspired the Unitarians, who proselytized among Indian elites. Toward the end of the 19th century, the Theosophical Society further popularized universalism in the Western world and Western colonies. In the 20th century, this form of universalist perennialism was further popularized by Aldous Huxley in his book, The Perennial Philosophy, which was inspired by Neo-Vedanta. Huxley and some other perennialists grounded their point of view in the commonalities of mystical experience and generally accepted religious syncretism. Also in the 20th century, the anti-modern traditionalist school emerged in contrast to the universalist approach to perennialism, inspired by Advaita Vedanta, Sufism, and 20th century works crucial of modernity, such as René Guénon's The Crisis of the Modern World. Traditionalism, also perennialism, emphasizes a metaphysical unitary source of the major religions in their orthodox forms and rejects syncretism, scientism, and secularism as deviations from the truth contained in their concept of tradition. A summary of the definition: there is no universally agreed upon definition of the term perennial philosophy, and various thinkers have employed the term in different ways. For all perennialists, the term denotes a common wisdom at the heart of world religions. And of course, this idea is rejected by most exclusivists and orthodox exoteric practitioners, perhaps even a heresy, I would say. But exponents across time and place have differed on whether or how it can be defined. Some perennialists emphasize a sense of participation in an ineffable truth, or one that cannot be described by mere human intellect and wisdom or words. An ineffable truth discovered in mystical experience. Words do not give it justice, though ultimately, beyond the scope of complete human understanding, others seek a more well-developed metaphysics, drawing upon the same Renaissance foundations in 20th century, the mystical universalist interpretation popularized by Aldous Huxley, who also wrote A Brave New World, and the metaphysical approach of the traditionalist school became particularly influential. And I would say that a major difference between exclusivist fundamentalist thought within whatever particular religious form you would bring to mind, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, or other, is the difference between being a particularist and a universalist in one's thinking. So it's primarily a level or level of consciousness, which brings to mind the spectrum of consciousness teachings of Ken Wilber, which also can add a fascinating insight into this particular idea of universal as opposed or versus being a particularist in one's religious thought and upbringing. So it's a large difference is its lack of metaphysical perspective, I would say, in religious fundamentalist types of thinking. Specifically, ideas of within eschatological frameworks, which is where we're headed on the subject of Antichrist or the system. So, about the author in this back cover book report, Charles Upton's life and work, a short from the website World Wisdom, and I'll leave a link in the description. Charles Upton's life and work, if you're interested in knowing more about the man. Here's a short biography of Charles Upton. Charles Upton is a poet, author, and activist who has published numerous books on Sufism, which is a branch of mystical Islam, metaphysics, and that's important. You should not discount metaphysical inspection of your religious beliefs. And a lot of modern theology has done this by compartmentalizing and isolating itself as an academic category. No theology is an island. Metaphysics and other topics. He was born December 13th, 1948 in San Francisco. After graduating from a Catholic high school, Upton involved himself in a number of anti-war demonstrations and became acquainted with many influential figures of the Beat generation, including Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg. He published his 2 volumes of poetry at age 19. Throughout the early 80s, Upton became involved in the New Age movement for several years before being introduced to the study of traditional metaphysics. I would say this is perhaps where things became more interesting in his life. His increasing interest in traditional studies culminated in his initiation into a Sufi order near the end of the decade. He would later revisit his prior intellectual interests in the form of a traditionalist critique of New Age spirituality entitled The System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and New Age. Upton currently lives in Lexington, Kentucky. Upton contributed the article, The Transcendent Unity of Religions and Spiritual Practice, to the forthcoming World Wisdom book entitled Crossing Religious Frontiers. So undoubtedly he has a multi-faith perspective. So in my research, I've done quite a bit of comparative eschatology and theology, which is what this particular channel emphasizes. So on to the book itself, The System of Antichrist, from the back cover, examines the present religious and cultural scene from the standpoint of traditional metaphysics and critiques New Age spiritualities within their postmodern context. In many references to Rene Juan and Friedrich Schwann, also help introduce these important but little known traditionalist thinkers. The book presents lore relating to the latter days of the present cycle from the vantage point of comparative religion, drawing upon relevant doctrines from Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and the Native American traditions. So it's quite pervasive and extensive, which is what metaphysics basically focuses on. It is also speculates upon social, psychic, and the spiritual nature of that being known to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam as Antichrist, or what many have said, the Antichrist, as a single individual, as posited by certain fundamentalists in left behind theology, presenting him as both an individual and system, and warning those willing to be warned against the spiritual seduction and terror he represents, and against the regime which will be and is the social expression of that seduction and that terror. Finally, in tracing the roots of Antichrist in the fallen nature of man, the author sketches the particular quality of spirituality proper to apocalyptic times, the dangers it faces, the unique opportunities open to it, and along the way he describes his own course from the spiritual revolution of the 1960s through the world of New Age spiritualities to the threshold of traditional esotericism and metaphysics. As he says, speaking of the angst of that characterizes the modern world, the specific medicine for the shock of despair is the deeper shock of meaning. Nothing but the weight of eternity breaking through the thin, brittle shell of the postmodern sky can set us on our feet. Charles Upton is a serious thinker for whom I have learned much. His writings merit close attention. Houston Smith, author of The World's Religions, etc. Charles Upton set out to portray the spiritual landscape of our time, from the subtle appeals of New Age spiritualities to the enlightening perceptions of the traditionalist writers along the way, he has succeeded in lifting the mask of today's world to reveal the dark and sinister forces that prevail everywhere and that actually herald the coming of Antichrist, whether that's an individual or a system. In my opinion, I would say that it's a system that has been here for quite some time and leads to an individual, or potentially, which could or could not, or maybe not transpire at all, giving its close proximity to the second coming of Christ, who annuls all that is Antichrist upon his coming. And if you, in my opinion, this coming of Antichrist Christ / Christ is a parallel and simultaneous happening in the world. In this tour de force, the author takes the reader on a journey to places he could not get to on his own. The kind of critique and discernment that Charles Upton brings to the subject of contemporary spirituality is much needed. He wakes us up to the metaphysical hazards, spiritual toxicity, and moral pathology latent in the spiritual teachings we embrace without sufficient awareness of their implications. He offers this analysis not in the name of any ism, although the isms aren't necessarily excluded, but with a deep awareness of the potential wisdom behind all authentic sacred traditions. And I would say that each tradition, in one way or another, has its own version of evil, or the face of evil, or a betrayal known as Antichrist, or the devil incarnate in some way or another. He is a responsible guide in the bewildering territory the searching soul must traverse in these times. I consider him a friend of the truth. From the author of Living Presence and the Knowing Heart. And that is quoting the back cover of The System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age. And now to read some select paragraphs from the inside of the book without giving away too much. I would highly recommend this reading to any doing research on Christianity and its ideas, or doing comparative theology and or eschatologies, because this brings up a wide array of perspectives. Who are the traditionalists? From Chapter 2. The traditionalist writers deal primarily with traditional metaphysics, which has little or nothing to do with most of what you'll find in the intra-physics section of your local bookstore. Books on magic, psychic powers, and UFO encounters Metaphysics is mystical theology and or philosophy. It has more to do with Plato and St. Augustine than with Aleister Crowley or Terry Cole Whitaker. And that veers off into occultism, I would say. Most people investigating religion and spirituality these days will tend to get the impression that there are only two basic choices: the fundamentalist Christian right, predominantly left behind theology with the subject in mind, or the world which includes liberal Judeo-Christianity, Eastern religions, neo-paganism, and the New Age. This is, of course, an oversimplification. There can indeed be more categories, since there are plenty of liberal Christians and members of Eastern religions who don't identify with the New Age, as well as non-Christian forms of fundamentalism, such as that of some Muslims, though by no means all, Jews, or even Hindus. But broadly viewed, the person interested in religion, but as yet without a solid commitment, will tend to be pulled in one of these two directions. And if he or she can't identify with either of them, then the prospect for serious religious commitment will look pretty bleak, perhaps veering off into atheism or agnosticism. And cynicism in religious matters seem the only mature response. This is where the traditionalists come in. Like some of the liberals, they recognize the validity of all the world's major religions. And one reason perhaps being is that they indeed do exist, and we can't pretend otherwise, as some do. But where the liberals will often pay lip service to mysticism while taking it out of its true context, the traditionalists recognize in mysticism and metaphysics the true center and depth of every religious tradition. The depth at which we can truly say that every religion, from its necessarily unique perspective, is talking about the same divine reality. Call it the source, the ultimate, or God. On the other hand, like the conservative Christians, they understand that a religious tradition is something sacred that can't be changed at the whim of fashion without destroying it. And that to chaotically mix elements from different religions, known as syncretism, trying to create some kind of ecumenical mishmash, is to desecrate religion itself, since it's as necessary for God to reveal himself in different unique religions or religious forms as it is for there to be different and unique human beings. The liberals are wrong when they think that the only valid kind of ecumenism is syncretism, the mixing of religions, and the conservatives are wrong too, not only because they can't see the divine operating in other religions than their own, but also because they don't know how to distinguish the heights of mysticism and metaphysical philosophy from the most frivolous and dangerous search for magical and psychic powers, and consequently tend to cast out vast areas of their own tradition. The fathers of the church, who were great metaphysicians, like Clement of Alexandria or Gregory of Nicaea, are not to be compared with L. Ron Hubbard, the great Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart or St. John of the Cross, are not to be confused with Carlos Castaneda. As far as I can tell, only the traditionalists really understand these principles, since they are neither chaotic liberals nor exclusivist conservatives. They represent a real third force in religion today. And now to sum this up, to read briefly some paragraphs from the introduction of this work, I quote, actually the preface and then the introduction. This is what the preface iterates. In this book, I will essay 10 things to take soundings in the present religious and cultural scene from the standpoint of traditional metaphysics and not theology alone. To introduce to a wider reading public the doctrines of the traditionalist school, Rene Juan, Ananda Swami, Frajas Swan, Martin Lings, Houston Smith, to name a few. And in the process, give the reader a glimpse into the city of traditionalism and the field of spiritual battle presently surrounding it. 3, on the basis of traditional metaphysics, to critique the doctrines of the New Age spiritualities within the context of postmodernism, of which they are one expression. 4, to demonstrate in the course of this critique that metaphysics, mysticism, and esotericism are fundamentally different from and often radically opposed to magical practices, the pursuit of psychic powers, and the channeling of spirit entities. To demonstrate to my Christian friends that they are not the only ones who see in neo-paganism and the New Age a decline in our culture's understanding of both God and man. To present love and prophecy relating, or rather to present lore and prophecy relating to the latter days of the present cycle from the standpoint of comparative religion, drawing upon relevant doctrines from Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and the Native Americans. To publish the signs and speculate upon the social, psychic, and spiritual nature of that being known to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam as Antichrist. To present it or him as both an individual and a system, to warn those willing to be warned against the spiritual seduction and terror it or he represents, and against the regime which will be and is the social expression of that seduction and that terror. To trace the roots of Antichrist in the forgetful and or fallen nature of man. To begin to define the particularity or the particular quality of spirituality proper to apocalyptic times, the dangers it faces, the unique opportunities open to it. To trace my own course from the spiritual revolution of the 1960s through the world of the New Age spiritualities to the threshold of traditional esotericism and metaphysics. And so those are the predominant 10 points that this work covers. From the introduction, we read, at the beginning of the third millennium, the human race is in the process of forgetting what it means to be human. We don't know who or what we are. We don't know what we are supposed to be doing here. In a cosmos rapidly becoming nothing to us but a screen for the projection of random and increasingly demonic fantasies, human life is no longer felt to be valuable in the face of eternity simply because it is a creation of God, nor is it as easy as it once was for us to see the human enterprise as worth something because of our collective achievements or the historical momentum which produced them, since without a scale of values rooted in eternity, achievement cannot be measured, and without an eternal goal toward which time is necessarily tending in the spiritual, not the material sense, given that eternity cannot lie at the end of an accelerating linear momentum, which is precisely a flight from all that is eternal. History is a road leading nowhere. The name we've given to this state of affairs is postmodernism. We all somehow know this, we feel it in our bones, but we can't encompass it. We can't define the scale of what we face or what we've lost because we no longer possess the true scale of what we are. We assume the name postmodern, but it would be closer to the truth to say that we are post-human, not in essence but in effect, since any concept of human nature adequate to the human essence has been discarded as passé. Humanism is not enough to tell us what it is to be human. Science is even less capable of shouldering this burden, which is why it has mostly given up trying. Only religion, understood in its deepest sense, can ask this question and answer it, and only through understanding of the social and psychic forces that hide the face of the absolute and infinite reality we call, quote unquote, God, can show us the true scale of what menaces the human form in these latter days, when the present cycle of biological and human time is drawing to a close. If the name God denotes the eternal truth of things, and the name man the central mirror of this truth in terrestrial space and time, then the name of those forces of obscurity and denial which are opposed to man in their fully revealed and terminal form is Antichrist. Another section from the introduction, the latter days. It is common nowadays for many to imagine that the universe, in line with progressive and evolutionary ideas, must somehow be advancing spiritually. If we come to the conclusion that the spiritual evolution of the macrocosm is not possible, we may even wonder what is the worth or profit in material existence? What good is it? What is it for? For fear of becoming Gnostics who deny the value of terrestrial life, we end up by denying the eternal significance of this very life. The problem with the concept that the universe evolves to higher levels of organization, which is basic to the doctrines of Teilhard de Chardin, Rudolf Steiner, and many other New Age teachers, although I would categorize these two within an esoteric Christian cosmology. They did tend to blend certain New Age concepts, but they weren't specifically, in my estimation, New Age teachers per se. Nevertheless, we read, as well as to the attempt within Judaism to apply Lurianic Kabbalah, and within Ismailism, the idea of a mass unveiling of spiritual realities to historical evolution is the second law of thermodynamics. This law states that via entropy, the overall order of matter/energy is the universe is always decreasing, a decrease which is inseparable in principle from the expansion of the universe starting at the Big Bang. Now I would add here a comment based on the recent findings of the Webb telescope. It is definitely leading scientists to question their theories. Big Bang theory, for instance, perhaps never transpired based on their current findings and models of the universe. So they're backtracking a bit, I would say, from Big Bang cosmology. And it is, in fact, on the table that perhaps earlier theories were more accurate, precisely that the universe is eternal and never had a beginning, as posited by the Big Bang theory. So it is a possibility that we are in an eternal universe. Continuing, at one point, scientists posited the existence of large amounts of dark matter, which would allow the universe to contract again via gravitation after the momentum of the Big Bang is spent. As of this writing, however, scientific opinion is running away from this hypothesis, so it would seem that the material universe must continue expanding and its disorder increasing forever. And in my opinion, this hypothesis is very partial. Our knowledge of the universe is indeed minuscule compared to how it could be. This is strictly in line with traditional metaphysics. This whole world is on fire, said the Buddha. All is perishing, says the Quran, except his face. That would be Allah, Muslims' version of God. Creation in the traditional view is a successive stepping down of higher orders of reality to lower ones. God, who in his essence is totally beyond form, number, matter, energy, space, and time, must, as Schwann never tired of pointing out, overflow into these dimensions of existence because he is infinite. No barrier exists in his nature which would prevent the radiation of his superabundant being. Traditional eschatologies, by and large, are in line with the second law of thermodynamics, in place of progress, a myth no older than perhaps the 17th century, at least in its present form. They posit a spiritual, social, and cultural entropy. This is certainly true of Hinduism and classical Greco-Roman mythology, and their idea that a given cycle of manifestation emerges fully formed from the Creator in the form of a golden age, to be succeeded by a silver age, a bronze age, and finally by the present iron age, which ends in an eschatological cataclysm, the purification day, after which the golden age of the next cycle commences. This scheme is more or less accepted through different mythological languages by traditional Jews, Christians, and Hindus, and even Lakota Sioux Indians and other primal peoples. The Buddhists, through their doctrine of cycles, tends to deny the possibility of an abrupt renewal, also accepts that the present era will end in cataclysm. Those doctrines within traditional revealed religions would seem to speak of the spiritual progress of the manifest world itself, such as the concept in the Kabbalah of a universal restoration, are either a misapplication of the lore of individual spiritual development to collective history, usually in line with the 18th century Enlightenment ideas of progress and their Renaissance precursors of the doctrine that God continually creates and holds in existence this manifest world and may therefore give an individual religious dispensation or particular nation a special role in renewing the divine image for a given human time and place within the larger context of overall spiritual degeneration or of the eschatological return of all manifestation to God at the end of time. Whatever is created must leave the house of the Creator in order to come into existence. Whatever has emerged into cosmic manifestation has already begun to die. Believers periodically predict the final, though temporary, triumph of evil in the latter days, the end of the world and the coming of the Messiah. Non-believers routinely scoff when such predictions seemingly fail to materialize. They will have the opportunity to continue scoffing until the world really does end, after which neither believers nor non-believers will, in worldly terms at least, have either the opportunity or the impulse to say, "I told you so." At the ultimate moment of truth, they will find themselves face to face with a reality, capital R, that is ultimate reality, or what metaphysicians often label as the absolute, what religions call God, face to face with a reality so profound, so rigorously demanding that their opinions, right or wrong, along with all the psychological reasons they had for holding them, will dwindle into insignificance. Only their essential motive for holding to truth with a capital T or sinking into error will remain to them as the sign of their eternal destiny before the face of God. Non-believers say some people in every generation have always thought they were living through the darkest times in history. All this whining about the degeneration of humanity in the latter days is nothing new. And believers, at least traditional believers, agree with them. According to a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, No generation will come upon you that is not followed by a worse. The course of history is not uniformly downward in the traditional view. There are peaks and troughs, religious revivals, redresses, partial renewals of a given spiritual tradition, leading to small and short-lived golden ages, heroic struggles of succeeding generations to cut their losses and restabilize society on lower levels, delirious renaissances based on the sudden impulse to squander the cultural and spiritual capital inherited from earlier ages. But the basic drift is always away from order and in the direction of chaos, or what can generally be described as heaven and hell, order and chaos. The ability of the race to see, understand, draw its life from the base and base its social and cultural forms on higher spiritual realities inevitably diminishes as it speeds even farther from the spiritual sun, S-U-N. The light of truth fades into the surrounding darkness, and the warmth of life fades along with it. The final result of this inevitable process is the end of a particular world or eon or world age. Or Kali Yuga. This world may never end according to the timetable of those simple-minded people who take eschatological predictions literally, but it will have to end sometime. And given that we presently have more ways at our disposal than ever before in human history of bringing this world to an end in concrete terms, through nuclear, chemical, or biological warfare, or environmental degradation, or the destruction of the human form itself through a genetic engineering driven by blind economic forces, transhumanism, for example, by the whims emotionally imbalanced or demonically inspired fools, and certainly by primal human fear and desire untempered by even the shadow of wisdom. A meditation on the end times is timely, to say the least, and in sober fact, it is always timely. Every day, a new generation passes into oblivion. It is always the worst of times, one day farther from the Garden of Eden, when the world, fresh from the Creator's hand, was young, and always the best of times, one day nearer to the inevitable moment when contingency and illusion must crumble and absolute reality dawn, definitively upon this dying world, this moving image of eternity. And now to sum up this back cover book report on the System of Antichrist by Charles Upton. A word on the Christ, Messiah, and Antichrist dichotomy. The Antichrist. The spiritual degeneration of humanity cannot go on forever. It must reach a terminal point beyond which the human form itself, at least in its earthly incarnation could not survive. And in line with the principle of the corruption of the best is the worst, the nadir of human spiritual receptivity must, according to the doctrine of many spiritual traditions, manifest not simply as the disappearance of spirituality, but as the satanic counterfeit of it. And this would apply to at least 5 of the main spiritual traditions. Each one has a shadow side, I would say, or what you would call a satanic counterfeit. Including a clever counterfeit Christianity. This is the origin of the myth of Antichrist, or the Antichrist, which few in the West realize is as important in Islam as it is to Christianity, given that Muslims believe that the Prophet Jesus will return to earth, as do the Christians, at the end of the age to give battle to that adversary and slay him in battle. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God. Just as the ego is the shadow of the divine self within us, so is the Antichrist is the shadow of the Messiah, of the eschatological Savior who represents the complete unveiling of the divine self as the end of this cycle. The divine self can say, I and my Father are one. The ego will often reach a climax of despair, delusion, and violence just when a spiritual breakthrough is imminent. In the same way, Antichrist will gather to itself or himself all the social and psychic forces which have willed to resist God at the very moment the face of the Absolute is about to dawn upon the world. Or in Revelation terms, to unveil. The words of Meister Eckhart might well have been said of the Antichrist, as they were most certainly said of the human ego. The more he blasphemes, the more he praises God. And in that sense, I would say that is the function of the shadow or Antichrist, in opposition to the divine self, or in fact a renunciation of God in place of God. That ego self exalting itself above all that is called God, as is reiterated in Scripture. And now on to the next and final reading of some of this material from the introduction. The Messiah, Christ, the Anointed One, Savior, Jesus, Yeshua. Throughout history, religions which look for a Messiah have always tended to concretize him. This or that Mahdi rises within Islam, only to be either co-opted or defeated. Sabati Zevi, the false Messiah, profoundly moves the whole Jewish world in the 17th century and then converts under threat of death by the Turkish Sultan to Islam. And Christianity is certainly not without its false Christs and false prophets. So who is the real Messiah? How can we recognize him? The real Messiah is eternally arriving in this world, eternally shattering its spatio-temporal dimensions, and eternally drawing his followers into the fellowship of his kingdom. For the reason alone that this kingdom is indeed eternal, everlasting, to everlasting. To the degree that false messiahs are receptive to this truth, they are actually in some sense partial messiahs, imperfect reflections of the Messiah himself, a shadow of Messiah, if you will. In Jungian terms, Satan as associated with the ego, but to the degree that they identify with their messianic role on the level of the ego, thereby pandering to the collective ego of their followers. And so, therefore, the collective ego of their followers end up worshiping that which is pseudo or false. And they always do. They are antichrists, plural. Humanity, sunk in materialism, cannot be awakened from the nightmare of history without some form of historical hope. Yet this hope is always dashed. The revolution is co-opted. The Renaissance fades. The spiritual renewal inevitably becomes food for the literalization of the doctrine and dogma and hardening of social and cultural, and I would say religious lines. The spirit is always giving life. The letter is always dragging that life into the tomb of contingency, into time and history. Those who, responding to messianic hope, pass from the turmoil of the time to the vision of eternity, have met the real Messiah. Those who fail to break their pact with time, temporality, ego, either because they hope for something from fate and contingency, or foolishly believe that they can manipulate them for their own ends, have fallen into the snare of Antichrist. End quote. And this is quite an extensive text. So my reading of it has been quite brief, but you get the overall picture as to the importance of this writing. And if you're doing comparative theology and eschatology, it's definitely something you should consider reading. Not just reading, understanding and absorbing the depth by which Charles Upton elaborates his concepts within the traditionalist and perennial philosophy and wisdom teachings. And so he speaks from experience and not just from a dogmatic orthodoxy. He's honest about his views. So if you're unfamiliar with the system of Antichrist, Truth, and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age by Charles Upton, I would highly recommend you read this book. For such a time as this. Thank you for listening. This has been Back Cover Book Report.